Part two of my two-part interview with Dr. Zach Bush. Zach is a triple board certified medical doctor. He's a transcendent voice in the noise that's surrounding COVID 19 right now. In part one, we covered a lot of ground, but we certainly weren't done. We need to get into part two now. I'm excited to share this with you. Here we go. We're very misguided in our thinking and orientation, the lenses we're looking through toward this. Even if you were to buy the germ theory in the way that they propose it, there's still a lot of nonsensical politicalized aspects to how we've gone from being a somewhat free society to a tyranny. How there's the forced mandates without any sort of a democratic process. Masks have to be worn and businesses have to be shut down and people have to stay home and physically distance from each other, et cetera, et cetera. And we could spend hours just talking about how misguided that all is. The complete sterilization of everywhere that you do go, if you happen to get out, there's going to be a consequence to that. The cure has become worse than the disease for sure. So that's all kind of like a given. It's a granted. You've laid out beautifully the right context and to understand viruses, and then more specifically looking at this particular coronavirus and maybe new perspectives on how to perceive it. And then secondly, you've also very elegantly portrayed that fact that this virus is not something that we need to be fearful of, that it's not outrageously deadly, that we're not going to have bodies in the street. And it's not only something that you were saying at the front end of this, the reality is here we are now and the data is in. We don't have to speculate about it anymore. But what we do have to be concerned about, with all those almost being a given, what we do have to be concerned about are the vaccines now. So now they're saying, okay, here's what happened, folks. We had a plan. The plan was everybody go hide in your caves. Do not come out at all if you can avoid it. Just on the necessities. Come out, get your food, go back and hide. Distance from each other socially. Get depressed. I just read an article this morning saying that in Japan there were more suicides in the last 30 days than there were deaths from corona for the entire year. So we're creating all these psychiatric issues that are emerging right now. But now they're saying, okay, now just come out. We're going to inject everybody, and then we're going to go back to normal life pretty soon. So this is the culmination, basically, of everything that you've been talking about. Can you give us your views and thoughts about the varying vaccines that are being proposed and kind of how you see this whole mess?
So, before I even dive into the complications of the vaccines, I want to back up again and maybe drive a deeper stake on the understanding of the innate immune system versus the adaptive immune system. So I've mentioned a couple of times the innate immune system being this second-to-second, minute-to-minute regulatory system that controls the way in which we utilize genomic information from the viruses. The adaptive immune system makes downstream decisions on our relationship with not the viruses, but the proteins that we produce from the viruses. And the way in which this happens is that the innate immune system, which is making those second-by-second decisions, if the cell decides that it's going to take in this viral genomics, and so, for example, coronavirus is an RNA strand, so the virus is delivered through binding of the capsid of the envelope that sends across the world this viral particle to me. I breathe it in. It binds to my respiratory epithelial, the cells within my lung respiratory tree. I absorb that into my bloodstream. Now it dumps the genomic information into my bloodstream, and now it goes system-wide. And now the cells along the lining of my blood vessels can also take up, through actually the same receptors, some of those surface proteins and of the capsid of the virus and all of that, if my pulmonary respiratory tree starts to make more of those capsid proteins. So now my lungs and vascular tree can start to take this up and then distribute the genetic information diffusely through my body, or keep it expressed in the endothelium of my blood vessels or the epithelium of my lung. And so that innate immune system is making these decisions as to whether you use this information or not. Interestingly, RNA ribosomal transcription, which is a complex science word for decision to make proteins from genetic information, RNA ribosomal regulation is now understood to be the most complicated, the most highly regulated step in human biology of anything. And I'm an endocrinologist, and I can tell you one of the most complicated regulatory systems is the endocrine system, and it pales in comparison to the regulatory system at the genetic level. At the genetic level, we're now understanding there's over 200 different proteins that have to be present to turn on the transcription factors that will allow a ribosome to take that RNA into a protein. And there's another 80 that are there to suppress the activity of that ribosome. And so you need just the right balance between activators and suppressors of the genetic sequence transcription device before you even decide to make a virus or a viral protein. This is very important information because the way in which doctors are taught today and consumers are taught in the infographics that are coming at you from CVS onto the NIH right now is literally showing you that viruses suddenly take over the human genetic system and replicate themselves and attack your body. If that was the case, I would be dead instantaneously right now because I have 10 to the 15 viruses in my bloodstream. If they could all autonomously take over my cell, I only have a trillion cells at the most that are interacting with these viruses. If I look at my entire vascular tree and immune system, all this, I only have a trillion cells, and so that a trillion again is only 9 zeros, after it or whatnot. You start to get into 10 to the 15 with 15 zeros after it. So I have more viruses than I do have cells that are interacting with this genetic information. And so I would be instantaneously taken over if, in fact, the ribosomal RNA wasn't the most regulated step in human biology. It had to be for us to occur as a species. It had to be for the mammals to occur as a genus, because we needed a regulatory function to keep us in communication with the genomic sequences of the world, with this genetics stew. So the innate immune system has been keeping mammals in a dance with the greater world around us for millions of years. And we just showed up as Homo sapiens sapiens 200,000 years ago by the fossil record. So we are new on the scene, and the mammals were dancing with this genomics long before we showed up. If my body decides it needs to, integrate this RNA information into proteins and really start utilizing this genetic information, then all the system has to agree, okay, yes, we're going to use this new protein structure and we're going to start producing it in large amounts. We need it so much so that we're going to actually replicate the entire viral capsid and send it out throughout our body. In fact, it's so important that we want to make sure our loved ones are getting the same genetic information. So we're going to send out clouds of this in our respiratory secretions and everything else to make sure that everybody else is getting the same genetic update. But before I ever get an infection or become productive of this virus, my body had to make hundreds and hundreds of agreements that said, yes, this is not only good for us, it's good for the world. And so when we see a viral syndrome go, the genetic information is important to our biology. Now, we see death and dying from HIV or Hep C, and we say, well, that virus must be bad. Well, it's not the genetic information there. We know that asymptomatic HIV presence is rampant. In a study of 8,700 asymptomatic healthy individuals in the U.S., Europe, and Asia, where we have the lowest amounts of HIV and AIDS in the world, we looked at 8,700 healthy people that had actually all been screened for infectious diseases so that they could donate blood. So they had screen negative for HIV, Hep C, all these things. We took that group and looked for PCR evidence of HIV within that group, and at 5 times greater quantity than influenza was HIV. And so if this maps to the rest of the world, then we missed our current estimates on the HIV load in the population by 470 million people. And so we grossly underestimated the amount of HIV in the world because we kept thinking that HIV was a genetic sequence attacking humans. But in fact, it's not until you find a group of humans that have a poisoned or dysregulated innate immune system that HIV and all of the herpes viruses that have to be present to create AIDS can actually occur. In other words, HIV doesn't cause AIDS, which is that is like heresy in the science world. But in fact, we don't have ever had a science experiment where we tried to infect, some human or animal with HIV and we caused AIDS. It's never happened. The closest we came was when in a monkey simian study where we were able to cause some sickness and death, but the sickness and death that happened didn't look anything like AIDS. And so that was with us giving overwhelming amounts of copies and replications of this in a lab environment where the monkeys aren't in their healthy habitat, and we were able to cause some sort of clinical syndrome. We said, well, that must be enough. No, never mind that it doesn't actually cause low white blood cell counts and immune deficiency like we blamed it for being in as the cause of AIDS. HIV is present in people with AIDS, and so is 8 other common herpes viruses. And when all that is happening, it's symptomatic of or demonstrative of we just lost regulation with the 10 to the 15 viruses that are in that human being. So AIDS is a symptom of a collapse of the innate immune system. It is not an overexpression of a single virus. It's impossible that a single virus can cause AIDS because the symptoms of AIDS are actually Kaposi sarcoma and a very specific kind of leukemia, both of which come from herpes viruses, not from HIV. And so the syndrome itself is a dysregulation of it. So at the worst thing we can think of, maybe, HIV being this global pandemic that's now endemic in parts of Africa and every other place, what HIV could show us today, if we chose to turn our lens around, is the pockets in which we have damaged innate immune system within the human population. And why is that? Because these are areas of chronic malnutrition, poor access to food nutrients and good food systems. These are areas of high socioeconomic abuses, sex trafficking, child abuse, trauma, all of these things dysregulating the human experience. And then we see an overexpression of viruses in this population, and we blame it on HIV. That's the kind of systems thinking or systems reevaluation we have to do. So I wanted to lay all of that out to point out that the innate immune system is the whole story. And when we see something go pandemic or endemic within an environment, we can say that something's happened to the innate immune system. So what the hell is the adaptive immune system with all this vaccine story? So we're giving proteins in an injection that cause an antibody to be formed. That's the adaptive immune system. And if you've been paying attention this year, maybe you've gone to the doctor with a syndrome of an upper respiratory infection. You think, I wonder if I just had coronavirus. And you go and you say, hey, I was kind of weird last week. I had headache and feverish, and I just felt weird. And I think a cousin of mine had coronavirus, and maybe I gave them a hug. Can you just screen me? And the doctor, if they're up on their stuff, will tell you, oh yeah, we should totally screen you. I'll do what they're likely to do is say, I'll do a rapid test now and see if you're, and that rapid test is going to be negative because it was last week, and your virus only stays in your bloodstream for about 3 weeks, they'll tell you, or 3 days. Wait a second, the virus only stays in your bloodstream for 3 days? Yeah, in fact, the highest it really gets is on the day that you're symptomatic, and then it's immediately diminishing. In other words, your innate immune system will bring you into balance with that genomic information within 3 to 4 days, period. The sickness and the fevers and the recurring, syndromes of inflammation that can then happen over the next following weeks are the virus is already gone. And so what you're actually reacting to is an inability to adapt. And so if you're seeing a clinical syndrome where you're failing to take this new information in and you have a chronic inflammatory result that could lead to death, you've demonstrated that you don't have adaptive capacity. Your body decided you needed to make an adaptation to survive in the world, and your body didn't have the clinical reserves of antioxidants, clotting cascade factors, all these different things. And so in your dysregulated, exhausted, diminished, depleted state, you ended up into a chronic syndrome that we would call COVID-19, which of course is not the description of virus, but a syndrome. The virus was gone within 48 hours of the first symptoms. Fascinating. So the doctor says, okay, I'll do a rapid test and it's negative, but we should really get an antibody test to see if you were exposed a couple weeks ago. And so come back in 3 to 5 weeks, because it takes 3 to 5 weeks from this time of infection before an antibody shows up. Wait, what? Like the adaptive immune system shows up 3 to 5 weeks after I've already cleared the virus from my bloodstream? Yep, that's right. Come back in 3 to 5 weeks. Well, then why do we think the antibody has anything to do with clearing the virus if in fact it's the innate immune system that clears it? And what the heck is are we even measuring with the antibody? It turns out that the antibody that we're measuring when we say you have IgM or IgG positive, antibodies to SARS-CoV-2, it's actually not even the virus that it's to. It's one of the proteins that is made by the genomic information that's delivered to you. And so the adaptive immune system is saying, your balance is really off. Your innate immune system sucks right now. It can't seem to bring itself into balance with the homeostasis between protein synthesis and decision not to. So we better make antibodies to reduce the number of cells that are making this protein. But the virus is already gone. This is now genetic information that's been uploaded into your body, and your DNA is now deciding to make a protein that your adaptive immune system is saying you're overregulating. And so when we see a study come out on a vaccine and it says, good news, we vaccinated a bunch of people and there was a 94% reduction in the people with symptoms from SARS-CoV-19. They're being very specific about that. They'll say there's 94% reduction in COVID-19 cases, which is a clinical syndrome again. It's not the number of infections, because if they actually measure the number of infections, they'd be identical, because the adaptive immune system has nothing to do with your initial your absorption of that virus or your reproduction of the virus or its proteins. It doesn't have to do with that. So we're going to have the same number of cases of actual presence of the genetic information that we could call an infection, but it's the adaptive immune system's downstream ability to reduce the amount of subsequent, in the weeks following exposure to that genetic information, the way in which you produce it. And so what it could do is change your adaptive relationship to protein synthesis of your new gain of function that you've had from this genetic update, this new genomic capacity. And so we've got the wrong story completely. It is not attacking the virus. It doesn't make you, attack the virus better or anything else. It just says that in the event that your innate immune system is dysfunctional and you can't decide at the cellular level which protein you're going to produce at any moment accurately, then this thing might help as a stopgap down the road and do that. So that's the only scientific hope that we would have in a vaccine, is maybe downstream after a coronavirus infection, we might reduce the number of people that are overexpressing some proteins that might make them, acute inflammatory or chronically inflammatory, increase in their morbidity and mortality from heart attacks, strokes, something else. So is that, if that needs to be the narrative, first of all, this isn't going to protect you from coronavirus. This may reduce your risk of subsequent inflammatory inflammations. That should be the message from the CDC, NIH, WHO. Everybody should say that's the expectation. Anything else than that, they're lying, or at least trying to misconstrue. Lying sounds harsh, but frankly, it's scientific lie, and we know we have too much data from the last 100 years to say it's a wrong narrative. Now, interestingly, we have the problems. Okay, and so what we just described is the hope for the vaccine, which isn't to prevent infections, maybe reduce a little bit the inflammatory consequences, protein synthesis downstream. So the only place they can find a benefit then is to take individuals that are at high risk for the inflammatory cascade, i.e. Americans, and then put them into a study and say, hey, look, we reduced the amount of inflammatory consequences to Americans who are seeing this. Keep in mind, America has 4% of the entire global population, and we've reported over 20% of global deaths from this pandemic. So if those numbers are even remotely accurate, we have 5 to 8 times more, vulnerability to death than any other nation in the world. And that's actually probably quite accurate. Unfortunately, we rank 40th in the world or something for global health outcomes, from neonatal death on day 1 to expected age to cancer. We are awful. We're 40th in the world. We're behind every other industrialized nation in health outcomes. And so this pandemic should have shown us, just like, U.S., what are you guys doing? Where is your innate immune system? What are you doing to your food environment, to your air, to your water systems, everything else, to so predispose your population to something like this level of morbidity and mortality that you're seeing in the United States? And other countries are openly talking about this. African countries are saying, don't listen to the news. The Americans are sick people, and none of them are healthy. And so it's not a secret globally that we don't have a pandemic. We have a severe deficiency of health in the United States. And so that's where it's at. I apologize for the long-windedness on this. I'm trying to get to the story of what is the risk of the vaccine, but I think that it'd be better for your editors.
If I could just
pause here, you could ask that question.
Yeah, if I could represent, it's don't apologize, because this is what's, I think, critical. I think too many things are glossed over, and the consequence of which is people are able to parrot what other people said, but they don't really have context and understanding. And I think that's dangerous. I mean, some people basically, it's just another form of confirmation bias saying, I think for whatever my reasons are that this is true, like, why vaccines don't work, or I don't think vaccines are a good idea. And I heard a really smart guy named Zach Bush say that it was a bad idea, and some other people the same. So I'm gonna just repeat that, as compared to saying there's a flow of thinking and logic that kind of gets you there. And I believe that when somebody has this depth of understanding, that is when they are empowered to really be able to make a difference in the world, as compared to just towing a party line, if you will. And just kind of in summary there, because this is something that's really interesting, because you're right, vaccines traditionally, because not this COVID vaccine, but vaccines in general, traditionally, their efficacy is gauged by, is there antibody production, right? I mean, that's how they say, okay, hey, did we give the vaccine? Did it produce antibodies? Well, that infers immunity, but it really doesn't. And as you're describing, there's a whole bunch of things that happen in the immune system before antibodies are ever produced, if they're ever produced. It's way downstream. So to say that, because when they say, hey, the vaccine is 94% effective, are they saying sometimes, can we interpret that in some circumstances that what they're saying is 94% of the people that we gave the vaccine to were able to find an antibody in their blood later? That doesn't mean that they have protection or immunity. It just means that they got the body to artificially produce these antibodies.
Yeah, and even if they show you a 94% result in a clinical outcome, saying there was 186 people that presented with symptoms consistent with COVID-19 in the controls, and there was 16 in the group that was treated with vaccine. And so then they say, see, we had a clinical result. Again, they're telling you COVID-19, which is not a virus, it's a syndrome, not SARS-CoV-2. So if they really measured for SARS-CoV-2 with PCR and everything else, they would show no change. But the syndromic quality to their reporting right now is allowing them to camp this kind of fight or flight kind of phenomenon, or you need to attack before it attacks you kind of narrative about how vaccines work. And so again, that's inaccurate. But what they're really saying is there's less inflammatory consequences to seeing this genetic information. And one scary thought is that there's multiple systems that are now dysregulated, because we know that antibody presence doesn't stop the virus from coming in. It has changed your relationship to your response to not the virus, but actually the proteins that you can make. And so when you're making a lot of antibodies to a protein within that would be made from this new genetic update, you're not actually getting the update. If your body is trying to make the new protein to make a more robust inflammatory response against some toxin in your environment or some ecologic new threat that has now emerged as coronavirus has now emerged as an adaptive genetic sequence to make new protein and adapt away from that toxin. That's the kind of sequences that are likely occurring around us, and yet we're not telling that bigger story. We're telling this very narrow picture. So I'm concerned that if we put into widespread use this vaccine, which is frightening because it's a very specific type of new experience. We've never done a messenger RNA vaccine targeted antibody before, and so we're now targeting something that is very frighteningly common in our bloodstream. That's a whole other story there. But the reality around the adaptive immune system function here is you are now blunting whatever update they were having, which we now know from flu vaccine. If we blunt the genetic information from flu, we have now a decreased ability to resist coronaviruses, echoviruses, adenoviruses, other respiratory viruses in our environment. We can't have the same relationship to them, so we're more prone to complications from these other things. So what are we predisposing this generation to? And the answer is something we've never seen before. And so we are setting ourselves up for a new pandemic in the subsequent years as we reach some sort of critical mass of global population that are now vaccinated to have an artificial, adaptive immune system experience with coronavirus. We're setting ourselves up for an unseen threat in nature that's going to now be thrown off in its relationship and homeostasis or balance with our future immune systems as a species. That's frightening. So we are opening up Pandora's box here by doing something we've never done before at a higher level of intervention than we've ever done it before in a population, and we don't have a clue as to what we're setting ourselves up for just in the infectious disease kind of mindset category. If you back up a little further and realize that we now know that the microbiome is really critical, in the way in which we interact with the virome, very critical to our immune system's intelligence around autoimmune disease, it gets even more frightening. The amount of autoimmune disease that we could see come out in the next 5 years could be devastating. And we've already seen this happen. Every time we've introduced a new vaccine, starting all the way back in the 1950s, every new vaccine has correlated with, within 3 to 5 years, a jump in autoimmune diseases in the population that we've vaccinated. And so I'm very confident that we're going to have a devastating effect on global immunity and its intelligence to who we are. We're losing our self-identity as a human as our immune system gets more and more activated to our own cells. And so rheumatoid arthritis is the attack of the human joint from the human immune system. Type 1 diabetes is the attack of the beta islet cell in the pancreas from the human immune system. So Hashimoto's hypothyroidism, human immune system attacking the human thyroid gland. That's what we mean by autoimmunity, is it is your own immune system attacking your own body. It's not surprising that a screw up of the innate immune system by an abnormal stimulus that's not a complete viral capsid and all the proteins and all the regulatory steps that would be achieved through the innate immune system. It's an artificial change in your adaptive immune system without the intelligence of the innate immune system. And now the innate immune system starts to get confused. Like, wait, what? Like, what's this antibody here? Why are we being stimulated with macrophage to knock out all of these human cells with this? And so now, maybe those are not actually us. If the macrophages think they need to go clean up the thyroid, that must be foreign material. So the innate immune system changes the relationship and opens up the floodgates on the adaptive immune system to attack the thyroid gland. So it's very frightening to go mucking with something as eloquent and symphonic in its complexity as the innate immune system and its relationship to the adaptive immune system. We are about to do something terrifying. That's kind of 3-5 years out. One of the main concerns in the short run is that small percentage of people who get these RNA vaccines, it turns out, will create a hyperantigen response, which means that next time they see coronavirus, they are going to have an exponential increase in risk of morbidity and mortality from seeing that coronavirus. And so I believe that we are about to see a significant portion of the population, this isn't going to be the majority, but 5 to 10% of the vaccinated group. So if we roll out to, 1 million people, you can take 5% of that and trust that that group is now going to have a really high likelihood of dying from coronavirus next year, especially if you're vaccinating elderly or people with high comorbidities, which is exactly who we're going to go vaccinate, right? And so we're going to vaccinate a population, and next year or the year after, we're going to see the highest deaths from coronavirus in history, because coronavirus has never caused much mortality. We're about to really achieve the CDC's projections that this is 30 times more deadly than flu, and we're going to cause it by this hyper reaction to the RNA strand, this hyperantigen effect that's been long recognized in these RNA vaccines. This is a known phenomenon. Pharmaceutical companies know it. Regulatory groups like the FDA know it. The NIH knows it. The CDC knows it. The WHO knows that this is an inherent problem to RNA vaccines, and yet we are doing this to the population, especially make sure those low socioeconomic minority communities really know they need this vaccine. Holy cow, we are going to see a devastating event here. This might be the new Holocaust of our generation is going to be meted out through the human immune system for the first time, and that's a tragedy that is completely avoidable, and the science is sitting in front of us, and it's sitting there. But I can talk to anybody in the world, from my own family to doctors to CDC, and the levels of denial that the human mind can put into play make all of my words useless. And so I'm intrigued by that. I'm no longer offended. Initially, I was so frustrated and offended. I'm just kind of actually really interested to see what we do as a population. There's a lot of scientists out there that are banging the drum now saying we are doing the wrong thing. And yet the population is not confident enough yet by that, that other narrative, that counter narrative. Even though they're the only ones presenting science, the NIH is not presenting any science on any of these. The CDC is not showing us any safety data that would be at all reassuring that this is actually the right thing to do. And yet we have healthcare practitioners lining up to get this thing sight unseen, science misunderstood, adaptive immune system, prophets and proselytizers, there don't even know what the innate immune system is, and they are rushing for this thing. And so I'm so curious. What does this mean for humanity? We need this journey. This journey, however it unfolds in 2021, is the journey we need. And so, in a weird way, Patrick, I sit here with you in a little bit of state of grief for humanity and a little bit of state of awe for our gullible nature, the power of collusion within narratives, the power of that fight or flight, fear, guilt paradigm that you talked to. And I'm curious to see what journey humanity needs in the next year.
It's certainly chilling, and it does defy logic, and the need for this agenda is so strong that we're dealing with censorship. We can't talk about the conversation you and I are having right now. Is going to be banned on many platforms. I've already tried to have other conversations like this, and I keep getting shut down. Our Revealed Films work in many instances shut down, and we have to find alternate ways to try to get it out into the culture. And there's this. I love the word saying you're intrigued, because certainly you can engage a series of emotions that can be maybe even counterproductive.